Every year, roughly 1 million people make the journey to Machu Picchu. They take the train from Cusco through the Sacred Valley. They climb the switchback path in the early morning, time to arrive before the clouds lift. They stand at the Sun Gate and look down at the terraces and the towers and the perfectly fitted stone, and they feel the weight of something ancient and enormous. Guides tell them the site was built by the Inca. They explain the agricultural terraces, the astronomical alignments, the engineering of the water channels. They describe what daily life might have looked like. They offer the word Inca as an answer, but the Inca is not a name, it is a category. The man who ordered those stones quarried and carried and fitted together without mortar into a structure that has survived 6 centuries of Andean earthquakes had a name. The man who selected that precise ridge above the Urubamba River at that precise altitude for reasons that were specific and documented and politically calculated had a name. The man who, in the same decade he commissioned that estate, expanded a small highland kingdom into an empire of 12 million people spanning 4,000 kilometers from modern Colombia to modern Chile. That man had a name. His name was Patchakouti. You were never told this, not because the record doesn't exist, not because historians don't know, but because the mechanisms of colonial erasure were applied to the Inca world with a precision that makes what happened to other civilizations look almost careless by comparison. And because the tourism industry that eventually rebuilt Machu Picchu's global profile had no commercial incentive to give the monument back its architect. How does the man who built the most visited archaeological site in the Western Hemisphere disappear from his own monument? That is exactly what this video is about. If this is already rewriting something you thought you knew, drop a comment. I want to know what surprised you first. Before we get to what Patchakouti built, we need to understand who buried him and when that decision was made. The first systematic destruction of Inca historical memory began in 1532 and was mostly complete by 1572. Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast with 168 men and, through a combination of military ruthlessness, epidemic disease, and a fortunate interruption of an Inca civil war, captured and later executed the Emperor Atahualpa. Within 40 years, the Spanish had dismantled the administrative infrastructure of an empire that had governed 12 million people across terrain that remains, to this day, among the most difficult on earth. But what the military conquest began, the intellectual conquest finished. The Spanish colonial project required that the Inca past be rendered illegible, not simply defeated, but made to seem as though it had never been sophisticated in the first place. In 1572, the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo commissioned a systematic set of written histories of the Inca designed to do something very specific: establish that the Inca rulers had been tyrants and usurpers, that their empire had been built on illegitimate conquest, and that the Spanish arrival was therefore not a destruction, but a liberation. The historian Brian Bauer, writing in 2004, documented how Toledo's commissioned histories were explicitly political documents: interviews with selected informants, shaped questions, recorded answers edited toward a predetermined conclusion. The goal was not accuracy. The goal was justification, the quipus, the knotted cord recording system through which the Inca maintained administrative records, census data, tribute counts, when oral historical narratives were systematically burned throughout the colonial period. The Spanish priest Cristobal de Molina, writing in the 1570s, described Quipucamayocs, the specialists trained to read and maintain these records, being executed or driven underground. By 1583, the Third Council of Lima issued a formal ecclesiastical decree ordering the destruction of any quipus found to contain religious or historical content. We lost, in those decades, the equivalent of a national archive. What survived came almost entirely through the filter of Spanish colonial intention. The chronicles we have, from Chiesa de Leon, Sarmiento de Gamboa, and the mestizo writer Garcilaso de la Vega, are valuable documents, but they are documents written by people navigating colonial power, not neutral recordings of an intact civilization. So the erasure of Patchakouti was not an accident. It was the byproduct of a project to erase the legitimacy of everything he had built. Let's correct the record. The story of Patchakouti begins not with triumph, but with a crisis that should have ended his family's rule entirely. In the 1430s, the Inca were not yet an empire. They were a moderately powerful kingdom centered on the city of Cusco, one regional power among several in the Andean highlands. The Sapa Inca, the ruling title, was held by a man named Viracocha, and in roughly 1438, a confederation of neighboring peoples called the Chanca launched a large-scale military offensive against Cusco. The Chanca were a formidable force. They had already absorbed several neighboring groups. They outnumbered the Inca forces significantly. Viracocha, facing the attack, he made a decision that would have defined his legacy and probably ended the Inca as a political entity. He retreated. He took a faction of his army and withdrew from Cusco, effectively abandoning the city to the Chanca assault. One of his sons did not retreat. His name was Kusi Yupanqui. He was not the designated heir. He was not the eldest son. He was not the one Viracocha had groomed for succession. But when the Chanca army approached Cusco, Kusi Yupanqui gathered whatever forces remained and chose to defend the city. What followed, according to the chronicler Juan de Betanzos, writing in 1551, based on accounts from Inca nobility, including his own wife, a woman of royal Inca descent, was a battle in which the defenders were dramatically outnumbered and, by most material assessments, should have lost. They did not lose. The victory over the Chanca is surrounded by the usual mythological accretion of any decisive historical moment. Stones animated by the sun god, supernatural intervention, the earth itself taking the side of the defender. Set aside the mythology, and what remains is still remarkable. A junior member of the royal family, organizing an improvised defense of a city his own father had abandoned, won a battle that preserved the Inca state at its most vulnerable moment. The archaeologist Gary Urton, writing in 2007, noted that the Chanca defeat effectively ended that confederation as a regional power and opened the highland corridor south and west of Cusco to Inca expansion. After the victory, Kusi Yupanqui took a new name. He called himself Patchakouti. The translation is not figurative. In Quechua, the language of the Inca, Patchakouti means roughly he who transforms the earth, or cataclysm, not as a metaphor for ambition, but as a literal description of a world turned over. He had earned the name before he gave it to himself. He then did something that the historical record treats as almost procedural, but which was, in practice, a complete reorganization of political reality. He deposed his father. Viracocha, the man who had fled, was not executed. He was simply no longer Sapa Inca. Patchakouti took the title, and the transformation of the Inca world began. What matters here is not just that Patchakouti won a battle. It's that the battle revealed something about how he processed power, not as an inheritance to be protected, but as a problem to be solved. A man who defends a city his father abandoned does not think primarily in terms of continuity. He thinks in terms of what needs to be built from the position of what survives. That instinct would shape everything that followed. The wealth Patchakouti had won in battle was significant, but war against the Chanca was only part of the story. What Patchakouti did with the 40 years that followed would prove far more significant and far more dangerous to those who came after him. The Inca Empire that tourists encounter in the historical imagination, the vast administrative network, the road system of 40,000 kilometers, the system of state warehouses, the decimal census structure, the postal relay runners called chasqui who moved information across the continent at speeds that would not be matched for centuries. Almost none of that existed before Patchakouti. He didn't inherit an empire. He built one. The historian John Rowe, in his foundational 1946 study of Inca culture and history, argued that the construction of Tawantinsuyu as a functioning continental state was essentially the project of a single reign. Rowe's analysis, which remains the basis for most subsequent Inca scholarship, traced the territorial expansion under Patchakouti as the decisive structural event of South American pre-Columbian history. Before Patchakouti, a highland kingdom. After Patchakouti, the largest political entity in the Western Hemisphere, the expansion proceeded in several directions simultaneously, and organized by Patchakouti through a combination of direct military campaigning and what the Inca called persuasion before force, a diplomatic military hybrid in which a regional lord was first invited to submit peacefully in exchange for incorporation into the Inca redistributive economy, and only confronted militarily if that offer was refused. The anthropologist John Murrah, writing in 1980, documented what this incorporation meant in practice. The Inca did not simply extract tribute from conquered peoples. They absorbed them into a system of reciprocal obligation in which labor, not goods, was the primary currency. Communities owed the state labor for roads, for warehouses, for military service, for state construction projects. In exchange, they received food from state storehouses during famine, protection, access to goods from ecological zones different from their own, and integration into an administrative system that, whatever its coercive dimensions, functioned with remarkable efficiency. This is not a romanticized account. The system involved forced resettlement of entire communities, what the Inca called mitmakuna, used deliberately to disrupt regional identities and prevent coordinated resistance. Patchakouti did not build an empire through benevolence. He built it through a sophisticated combination of incentive, coercion, and institutional design that addressed the fundamental problem of governing people across radically different altitudes, ecologies, and languages. Picture the road system as it existed in 1470, roughly 30 years into Patchakouti's reign. Two parallel highways run the full length of the empire, one along the Pacific coast, one through the Andes. Branch roads connect them at intervals. At regular intervals along every road, a tambo, a rest station with food stores and accommodation, stands ready. Relay stations for the chasqui stand every few kilometers. A message sent from the northern edge of the empire in modern Ecuador reaches Cusco, 4,000 kilometers away, in roughly 10 days. The Spanish, when they arrived 60 years later, used this road network to conquer the empire that built it. We have their written accounts of how good it was. That network did not build itself. It was designed, funded, staffed, and maintained by a central authority that Patchakouti created almost from scratch. The reconstruction of Cusco itself was another of Patchakouti's projects. Historian Brian Bauer, in his 2004 study of Inca Cusco, documented the physical transformation of the city. Patchakouti redesigned the capital on a new plan, built the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, as the ceremonial center of the empire, and organized the physical layout of the city to correspond to the administrative and cosmological hierarchy of Tawantinsuyu. The Coricancha's interior walls were lined with sheets of gold. The courtyard contained life-sized golden statues of previous Sapa Incas. When the Spanish arrived and stripped it, the amount of gold they removed was sufficient to fund a significant portion of the Spanish crown's European military campaigns. That temple was Patchakouti's. That gold was Patchakouti's commission. And yet almost nobody who has heard of the gold of Peru knows his name. Everything Patchakouti built was remarkable, but there is one structure that concentrates in a single site everything about how he thought about power, architecture, landscape, and political legitimacy. And it is the structure millions of people visit every year without knowing whose idea it was. Machu Picchu was not a city. That is the most important thing to understand before anything else about it. The site sits at approximately 2,430 meters above sea level on a ridge between two mountain peaks, Machu Picchu, the old peak, and Huayna Picchu, the young peak, above the Urubamba River Gorge. It covers roughly 530 meters along the ridge and contains approximately 200 structures, including temples, residences, plazas, storehouses, and one of the most precisely engineered water distribution systems in the pre-Columbian world. The stonework in the most sacred structures, the Temple of the Sun, the Intihuatana, the Room of the Three Windows, is fitted to tolerances that modern engineers, examining it in the 20th century, found difficult to explain without powered tools. A knife blade cannot be inserted between the stones. The site was not discovered by Hiram Bingham in 1911. I want to be precise about that claim, because it is repeated constantly, and it requires direct correction. Bingham, a Yale lecturer and explorer, arrived at a ridge above the Urubamba, guided by a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga, who was paid the equivalent of a day's wages to show him a ruin he and other local residents already knew existed. The site had never been lost to the people who lived in its vicinity. And what Bingham did was introduce it to an international academic and popular audience. The word discovery in this context does not mean what it claims to mean. What Machu Picchu actually was, its function, its political meaning, its relationship to Patchakouti, was established primarily through the work of the Peruvian archaeologist and anthropologist Luis Lumbreras, and, most definitively, through the research of the American scholar Richard Berger, whose 2004 analysis synthesized decades of archaeological and archival research into the site's probable function. Berger's conclusion, which is now the academic consensus, is that Machu Picchu was a royal estate, the personal property of Patchakouti, built as a combination of private retreat, ceremonial center, and demonstration of the Sapa Incas' command over landscape and labor. The estate was not inhabited by a permanent urban population. It was maintained by a dedicated permanent staff and occupied seasonally by the Sapa Inca, his court, and the retinue that traveled with him. The terraces were productive agricultural land whose output supported the estate, but they were not the economic base of a city. They were the domestic agriculture of a royal household. This distinction matters, because the question is not simply, what was this place? The question is, why here? Why build a royal estate on an inaccessible ridge above a river gorge, requiring the transport of massive stones up terrain so steep that the logistics alone constitute an engineering achievement? What was Patchakouti signaling to the people who could see it, to the people who built it, to the cosmological order he was embedding himself within? The answer is threaded through the site's geography. The ridge aligns with specific astronomical events. The Intihuatana, the carved stone pillar sometimes called the hitching post of the sun, is aligned to mark the solstices with a precision that required both astronomical knowledge and engineering refinement. The Temple of the Sun is positioned so that sunrise at the winter solstice sends a beam of light directly through a specific window and onto a specific stone, illuminating it in a way that would be impossible by accident. The water channel that runs through the site descends from a spring above and passes through a sequence of 16 fountains in strict hierarchical order. The first fountain reserved exclusively for the Sapa Incas' ritual use. Patchakouti was not building a retreat. He was building a cosmological claim. The site said, in stone and water and aligned light, the Sapa Inca does not merely rule the people of the world. He stands at the junction of the sky and the earth. His water is first. His light is exact. The mountains that frame his estate are named for their relationship to him. That is a political document written in architecture, and the man who authored it had a name. The road system, the empire, the temple in Cusco, the estate above the Urubamba, all of it built in one reign by one man who transformed the organizational reality of a continent. But the conquest destroyed the empire. What happened to the evidence over the next 5 centuries is the part of this story that requires its own examination. The Spanish arrived in 1532. Machu Picchu was already old by then, built in the 1450s or 1460s, occupied seasonally for several generations, and already partly reduced in function by the time Pizarro landed. The site does not appear prominently in any Spanish colonial document. This has led some scholars to suggest the Spanish never found it. The archaeologist Johann Reinhard, writing in 2007, proposed that Machu Picchu's elevation and its distance from the main colonial roads contributed to its physical survival. The Spanish never stripped its stones because they never saw a reason to go there. But physical survival is not the same as historical survival. The erasure of Patchakouti's role at Machu Picchu was not accomplished by destroying the site. It was accomplished by destroying the context. When the Quipus burned and the Quipucamayaks were killed or silenced, and the Toledo Chronicles replaced Inca oral tradition with Spanish colonial narrative, what was lost was not the stone. The stone survived, but the attribution, the name, the account of who decided, who designed, who commanded. The Spanish colonial chronicles that survive do mention Patchakouti. Chiesa de Leon, writing in the 1550s, described him as the most important of the Inca rulers. Sarmiento de Gamboa, writing in 1572 under Toledo's commission, included a biography of Patchakouti, though shaped, as Bauer documented, by the political agenda of delegitimizing Inca rule. The name existed in the Spanish record, but the Spanish colonial record was not the record that reached the modern world's popular understanding of Machu Picchu. What reached the popular understanding was Hiram Bingham. Bingham's 1913 National Geographic article on Machu Picchu and the subsequent 1948 book Lost City of the Incas were the primary vehicles through which the site entered global consciousness. Bingham was not a professional archaeologist. He was an explorer and a popularizer with a flair for narrative and a theory he was committed to proving: that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the legendary last refuge of the Inca resistance after the Spanish conquest. He was wrong about this. Vilcabamba has since been identified at a different site entirely. But the narrative of Machu Picchu as a lost city, mysterious and nameless, served his book better than the accurate account would have. A lost city needs no builder. A lost city is atmospheric. A lost city sells. What strikes me about this is not simply that Bingham was mistaken. The explorers are often mistaken. It's that the lost city framing, a place whose origins were mysterious, whose builders were unnamed, was actively preferable, from a narrative and commercial standpoint, to the accurate account. Patchakouti is not a mystery. He is a documented historical figure with a recorded biography. Attributing Machu Picchu to him does not diminish the site. It makes it more extraordinary because it gives you a specific human mind behind the specific human decisions that shaped every stone. But the lost city narrative required that the mind be absent. The wonder depended on the anonymity. That anonymity was not incidental. It was the product. The Peruvian government began developing Machu Picchu as a major tourism destination in the mid-20th century, with significant international investment and infrastructure development accelerating from the 1980s onward. The UNESCO World Heritage designation came in 1983. By then, the site had been framed for 50 years through the lens of Bingham's Lost City, mysterious, pre-contact, belonging to a generalized Inca past rather than to a specific named, documented individual. The tourism infrastructure inherited that framing and built on it. Inca became the attribution. Patchakouti remained the absence. The correction began in the academic literature long before it reached popular understanding. Richard Berger's work in the 1980s and 1990s, building on Peruvian archaeological scholarship, established Patchakouti's authorship of the site with increasing specificity. The 2003 analysis by Berger and his colleague Lucy Salazar, titled Machu Picchu, Unveiling the Mystery of the Incas, synthesized the consensus. This was Patchakouti's estate, built during his reign, structured according to his political and cosmological program. That book was published in 2003. Roughly 21 years ago, the academic record was corrected. The popular understanding has not caught up. Every guidebook that calls Machu Picchu a mystery without naming its builder is repeating, consciously or not, the logic of the Bingham framing. Every tour that offers the Inca as the answer to the question of who built this place is offering a category where a name belongs. The name belongs to Patchakouti. What Patchakouti built did not die in 1532. This is the part that is least understood about the Inca legacy, and the most relevant to the world that exists now. On the road network Patchakouti designed, extended by his successors Tupac Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac, became the logistical foundation for Spanish colonial extraction. The same roads that moved Inca tribute moved Spanish silver. The same tambo infrastructure that supported Inca administration supported Spanish colonial governors. The Spanish did not build a new infrastructure for a new empire in the Andes. They occupied an existing one. Walter Rodney, in his 1972 analysis of colonial economic extraction in the developing world, observed this pattern broadly. European colonialism in the Americas and Africa was not a construction project. It was a takeover. The infrastructure of the colonized was the platform for the colonizers' enterprise. The census and administrative structures Patchakouti created, the decimal hierarchy, in the Ellis as the basic social unit, the Mitmakuna system of population relocation, were adapted, partially preserved, and partially distorted by the Spanish colonial administration into the Mata system, which became one of the primary mechanisms of forced indigenous labor extraction in the colonial Andes. The Potosi silver mines, whose output funded the Spanish Empire's European wars for 2 centuries, operated on indigenous labor organized through a mita system that derived directly from the Inca labor conscription Patchakouti had institutionalized. The empire he built was, in a documented and traceable way, the engine that powered its own colonization. The Quechua language, which was the administrative language of Tawantinsuyu, spread deliberately by Patchakouti as a unifying instrument of governance, survived Spanish colonization and remains today the most widely spoken indigenous language in the Americas, with approximately 8 to 10 million speakers across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Argentina. The language Patchakouti chose for his empire as a deliberate political tool is still a living language. That is not coincidence, that is institutional durability. And Machu Picchu itself, which Patchakouti built as a personal cosmological statement about one man's relationship to the sky and the mountains, that site now generates approximately $400 million in annual tourism revenue for Peru, employs hundreds of thousands of people in the tourism economy of Cusco and the Sacred Valley, and stands as the most recognizable symbol of an entire nation's identity. A royal estate built as a private possession of one man has become, 6 centuries later, a shared inheritance of a nation and a daily economic reality for hundreds of thousands of families. Patchakouti built it to last. He may not have known it would last this long, but he built it in materials and at tolerances and on a geological foundation that made duration almost inevitable. The precision was not aesthetic. It was structural. Andean earthquakes have collapsed Spanish colonial buildings throughout Cusco, while the Inca foundations beneath them remained intact. There is a wall in Cusco where you can see exactly where the Inca stonework ends and the colonial Spanish construction begins. They look nothing alike, and only one of them is still standing at the original alignment. The survival of the stone is the last argument Patchakouti makes, not in words, not in documents that the Spanish could burn. In fitted stone, in aligned light, in channels that still carry water to the fountain that his people reserved for him, he is still there. He has always been there. We simply weren't told to look for him. You have now seen a photograph, or a film, or perhaps the actual stones of Machu Picchu. The site was built between approximately 1450 and 1470, on the order of a man named Patchakouti, the 9th Sapa Inca of Tawantinsuyu, who in the same decades also built the road system, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, the administrative infrastructure of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere, and the conceptual framework of a civilization that governed 12 million people across terrain that defeated every European army that tried to subdue it for decades. His name was not lost. It was placed out of reach. There is a difference. History did not forget Patchakouti. History was told to look the other way. Which story do you think history buried the deepest, the person or the place they built? Tell me in the comments, because the answer shapes what we cover next. The next video is about an empire that Rome feared, that controlled the trade routes Europe depended on, and that was written out of history so completely that most people today cannot name it. That video is already here.